We continue our series on the Gospel of Mark. Mark intentionally structures his Gospel around two questions. Who is Jesus, and what does it mean to follow Jesus? Today's passage is the midpoint of Mark, where both questions are the direct focus of Jesus' words to his disciples at Caesarea Philippi. The answer to both questions, however, has been in the background behind everything Jesus has said and done up to this point. Jesus has proclaimed the arrival of God's kingdom. He has overcome sickness and demonic possession. He has challenged religious assumptions and overcome religious opposition. He's provided for people's physical needs and calmed dangerous weather. Such miracles and healings, and especially restoring hearing to the deaf, speech to the mute, and sight to the blind, was a sign that God was restoring his people. Based on scriptural interpretation, such healings signaled that God's people would soon be able to see, hear, and praise him freely once more. People came to Jesus because they were drawn by the hope of God's restoration in their physical bodies, in their spiritual lives, and their expectation that God's kingdom was being renewed. Jesus, however, repeatedly instructed the people he healed not to tell anyone about what happened. This is the same command to keep silent that he gave to demons. Why? Practically, Jesus did not want to be overwhelmed by crowds everywhere he traveled, but he also knew that his deeds and message invited opposition and misunderstanding. Jesus had reached out to the marginalized. He called ordinary people to be his disciples, rather than the religious or scholarly elite. He had visited the homes of tax collectors, rather than the respectable Jewish leaders. He took notice of and was sought out by people pushed to the sides of society due to their physical illness, religious uncleanness, or spiritual oppression. Jesus' mission was not to become a celebrity. He did not come to establish God's kingdom according to human standards. And people were still not ready to understand and accept Jesus' message. They were expecting a human king, not a divine king. Mark uses this secrecy to build narrative tension, so that when the secret that Jesus is the Messiah is revealed in Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, how it has been revealed is just as important as what has been revealed. The moment is the watershed of Mark's gospel, the turning point in the narrative that gets to the heart of who Jesus is and what he is all about. It shifts the focus of Mark's gospel from Jesus' message and work as the Messiah in his teachings and healings throughout Galilee to Jesus journeying towards Jerusalem, his confrontation with the increasingly hostile religious leaders, and in his passion, death, and resurrection. Mark frames this question of Jesus to his disciples and the declaration that follows at Caesarea Philippi with two short narratives: the healing of a blind man and the transfiguration. Mark links elements from both these stories to the questions, who is Jesus, and what does it mean to follow Jesus? Jesus restoring the blind man's sight acts as a bridge between these narratives. It is one of the last few healings recorded in Mark, and the twofold character of this healing is set between the disciples' inability to perceive Jesus' meaning of his words when he spoke about the teaching of the Pharisees, and their following misunderstanding about what it means that Jesus is the Messiah. Just as the physical sight of the blind man is at first partially restored, only able to perceive in vague shapes and movement, so also the disciples' spiritual sight is partial. Their perception of who Jesus is and their understanding of his purpose of Messiah is incomplete. However, just as the physical sight of the man was restored, there is hope that clear spiritual sight will also come to his disciples, and they will be able to fully understand the nature of Jesus' mission. Jesus' first question to his disciples at Caesarea Philippi, who do people say that I am, is a setup. It's often easier to report what other people are saying. The message and miracles of Jesus recorded in Mark demand some explanation from those who encountered Jesus. The crowds, the religious leaders, the disciples, all the people that Jesus taught and touched sought some sort of an explanation for who they encountered. But their answers come up short. Jesus is more than a prophet. So Jesus then asked the central question, who do you say that I am? The answer is Jesus is the Messiah. And this is the first time in Mark since the opening verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, that the word Messiah, or Christ, has been used. Popular beliefs about the Messiah in Jesus' time were varied, ranging from a Joshua-like figure who would lead a glorious rebellion against Rome to a David-like figure who would reestablish the Jewish kingdom, a Moses-like figure who would restore religious faithfulness to God's people, to an Elijah-like figure who would bring the end-time judgment on the nations. Jesus' actions and teachings may have confirmed him as Messiah, but they also challenged people's expectations, and so Jesus ordered his disciples to keep quiet. In stark contrast, however, he openly and plainly describes what it means for him to be the Messiah. He will suffer. He will be rejected by the religious leaders. He will be put to death, and he will rise from the dead. Such a picture of God's Messiah, God's anointed one, did not fit with the disciples' understanding. In their minds, the Messiah's suffering and dying was antithetical to the victorious character of the one who will inaugurate God's kingdom. Was not deliverance supposed to come from defeating God's enemies? How could being rejected by God's people and being defeated by death be the path to victory? Even the promise of rising from the dead was difficult for the disciples because their hope of a resurrection was still a distant last-day event in their minds. Their perception of Jesus was partial, and their understanding of his purpose incomplete. And so Peter tries to correct Jesus. Peter's protests were met by Jesus' rebuke to all of his disciples, which was harsher than any rebuke he had given to the religious leaders. "Get behind me, Satan," because it was imperative that his followers understand the nature of God's mission. God's ways are not human ways. To assume that God's kingdom was about human victory by conquest was completely counter to the good news that Jesus had announced. The power of God is not defeated by submission to humiliation, rejection, and death. Rather, it is magnified by it. Likewise, life is not granted by clinging on to life, but be willing to lose it. Confronted with Jesus' impending passion, the disciples were at a loss to see clearly. They required a transformation in their vision. Shortly thereafter, Peter, James, and John were given a glimpse of this type of transformation in the Transfiguration. Mark closely relates Jesus' question at Caesarea Philippi to his transfiguration on the mountain. It is a foreshadowing of the resurrection, a look into the true glory of Jesus, the Messiah. The scene echoes God's appearances to Israel on Mount Sinai. The presence of Elijah and Moses confirm that the Messiah's death is not a surprise, but a fulfillment of the Scriptures. The voice and the glory confirm that Jesus is the Son of God, and this is the one who will die and rise from the dead, and is also able to grant life. God works through the humiliation, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus to bring the required transformation of vision to his followers. While Jesus spoke openly about his own suffering and death to his disciples, he was even more open, including the crowd, about his expectation that his followers will share in his suffering. There is a cost to discipleship. Followers of Jesus are called to follow his example, including in his suffering. Deny yourself and take up your cross. These are challenging words, both due to their familiarity in Christian circles, but also due to their implications for our self-understanding. It is important to remember that for Jesus' disciples and for the early church, the image of a cross was a symbol of Roman oppression. It was an instrument of humiliation and death under a foreign and tyrannical power. Centuries of cultural and religious symbolism has reshaped our contemporary understanding of the cross, so that it's easy to forget just how shocking Jesus' words are. Taking up a cross is not just any burden, it is a death sentence. Likewise, self-denial is not merely spiritual language for humility. For the disciples and for the early church, Jesus' words meant literal martyrdom. With little influence or power in the socio-political world of Rome, the followers of Jesus faced persecution and death wherever they preached the message of the good news that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, and so challenged and threatened Roman authority, privilege, and power. Yet the early Christians accepted this humiliation, suffering, and death with the same willingness and faithfulness that Jesus had shown and displayed in God. Like the disciples, our perception of Jesus often requires restoration. The difficulty for the modern church, at least in places which do not experience persecution and martyrdom as in the early church, is that it has a long and complex history with power. Ever since the first Christian emperor Constantine, the church, especially in the West, has occupied a place of authority and influence within society. A look at church history shows how disastrous abuses and misuses of this power in the name of Christ can be, and great harm has been committed in Christian attempts to hold on to this power. Thus, it is vitally important that as followers of Jesus, as Christians, as the church, we revisit these words of Jesus and ask ourselves, who do we follow, and how are we being called to follow him? Today, Jesus is presented as many things, as a prophet, as a healer, as a miracle worker. Jesus is seen as a holy man, a spiritual leader, a great moral teacher. Jesus is seen as a revolutionary, an agent of social change, a champion for whatever cause or ideology most appeals to a community. Or Jesus is seen as a figure of religious imagination, a curiosity of history, or a product of the social-cultural debates in the early church. And there is a tendency of every person, group, people, and community, including the church, to try and fit Jesus into their worldview, to reshape Jesus, the Son of God, according to our own categories of understanding. This is the typical human response to Jesus, to either tame him or claim him, to either explain away the significance of Jesus' work and message so that he does not conflict with our agendas, desires, and expectations, or else to replace his words and deeds with our own ideas and concepts. But the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark is the Messiah. The way of Jesus is the way of the cross. I invite the worship team to come up, and I'll end by reading this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. Bonhoeffer wrote these words in 1937 in Berlin, Germany, reflecting on these verses. If any man would come after me, let him deny himself. The disciple must say to himself the same words Peter said of Christ when he denied him, I know not this man. Self-denial is never just a series of isolated acts of mortification or asceticism. It is not suicide, for there is an element of self-will even in that. To deny oneself is to be aware only of Christ and no more of the self. To see only him who goes before and not the road to which is too hard for us. Once more, all that self-denial can say is, he leads the way, keep close to him. The cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering, which every man must experience, is the call to abandon the attachments of the world, of this world. It is that dying of the old man which results in his encounter with Christ. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give our lives over to death. Thus it begins. The cross is not the terrible end of an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him, come and die.